From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
We got $6 billion for opioid and getting rid of that scourge that's taking over our country. And the numbers are way down.
This week, President Trump claimed the numbers are way down in the opioid epidemic. In fact, the latest statistics show there was an increase in opioid-related deaths and overdoses during Trump's first year in office. And the $6 billion Trump mentioned is in the budget for next year. Today, we'll look at the origins of the opioid epidemic and how Purdue Pharma, the manufacturer of OxyContin, knew more than 20 years ago that the drug was highly addictive, but continued to promote it with promotional materials like this.
The rate of addiction amongst pain patients who are treated by doctors is much less than 1%. They don't wear out, they go on working, they do not have serious medical side effects. And so these drugs, which I repeat are our best, strongest pain medications, should be used much more than they are for patients in pain.
Since that video was recorded, more than 200,000 Americans have died from opioid overdoses. We'll speak for the hour with Barry Meyer, author of Painkiller, An Empire of Deceit and the Origin of America's Opioid Epidemic. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. President Trump ordered tariffs Thursday on imported steel and aluminum from Canada, Mexico, and the European Union, prompting criticism from U.S. allies who said they'll introduce retaliatory sanctions. The European Union said it would challenge the U.S. tariffs at the World Trade Organization. The tariffs came as Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau said talks to renegotiate NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, broke down after Vice President Mike Pence insisted any new deal include a 5-year sunset clause. Meanwhile, Mexico blasted the tariffs as the latest insult by a hostile Trump administration. This is Mexican Foreign Minister Luis Videgaray.
Mexico's position on trade or on immigration or on security or on whatever area of cooperation with the United States will not vary, not because of offensive rhetoric nor unjustified unilateral measures like this type. We will continue to defend the interests of Mexico just as we have done until now.
The European Court of Human Rights has ruled Lithuania and Romania violated the rights of 2 accused men by allowing U.S. Central Intelligence Agency to torture them in secret prisons. The court found the countries violated Article 3 of the Geneva Conventions, which requires the humane treatment of prisoners of war. Judges say Lithuania operated a secret CIA black site from 2005 to 6, where accused al-Qaeda recruiter Abu Zubaydah was tortured. They also ruled the prisoner Abdulrahim al-Nashiri was tortured at a CIA prison in Romania between 2004 and 5. The New York Times reports al-Nashiri was tortured at a separate CIA black site in Thailand in 2002, a prison that was overseen by Gina Haspel, who was confirmed last month as CIA director. In Spain, Prime Minister Mariano Rajoy lost a no-confidence vote in Parliament today as a major corruption scandal toppled his administration. Rajoy insists he was unaware of an alleged bribery ring that saw members of the Conservative People's Party receive cash payments in return for political favors. Pedro Sanchez, head of the opposition Socialist Party, will replace Rajoy as Spain's prime minister. Sanchez has the support of the anti-austerity Podemos party, as well as regional parties from Basque Country and Catalonia, although Sanchez has said he won't support Catalonia's bid for independence. Italian lawmakers have agreed to a coalition government led by Eurosceptic populists with Giuseppe Conte as Italy's new prime minister. The coalition brings the right-wing anti-immigrant League Party together with Five Star Movement, which seeks to abandon the euro as Italy's currency. In Nicaragua, armed supporters of President Daniel Ortega opened fire on a crowd of tens of thousands of anti-government protesters Wednesday, killing at least 11 people, wounding almost 80 others. Elsewhere in Nicaragua, another 4 were killed and scores more injured at demonstrations around the country, bringing the death toll in recent anti-Ortega protests to nearly 100. Wednesday's deaths came as some of the mothers of those killed led a protest dubbed the Mother of All Marches. The protests began in April as President Ortega moved to roll back workers' pension benefits. U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations Nikki Haley said Thursday she'll veto a UN Security Council resolution calling for the protection of Palestinians living in the occupied territories. The resolution, introduced by Kuwait, calls Israel's massacre of Palestinians at recent nonviolent protests in the Gaza Strip excessive and indiscriminate. Israeli snipers have killed at least 116 Palestinians since late March, while injuring some 12,000 others. Ambassador Haley circulated a rival resolution Thursday, primarily blaming Hamas for the deaths and injuries. Back in the United States, President Trump pardoned right-wing media personality Dinesh D'Souza Thursday, vacating his 2014 conviction for breaking campaign finance laws. D'Souza is known for his racist and homophobic comments, has previously called President Obama a boy from the ghetto, mocked survivors of the Parkland, Florida high school massacre, and assailed women activists as feminist whiners. Trump also signaled he's preparing to commute the sentence of former Illinois Governor Rod Blagojevich, who was sentenced to 14 years in prison on corruption charges that included trying to sell or trade President Obama's former U.S. Senate seat. And Trump is preparing to pardon TV personality Martha Stewart, who was convicted in 2004 of lying to investigators in an insider trading case. Both Blagojevich and Stewart once starred in Trump's reality TV show Celebrity Apprentice. Virginia Democratic Senator Mark Warner warned the pardons could be a signal to those indicted by special counsel Robert Mueller's investigation. Warner tweeted, quote, the possibility that he may also be sending a message to witnesses in a criminal investigation into his campaign is extremely dangerous. In the United States of America, no one is above the wall, Warner tweeted. California Democratic Senator Dianne Feinstein is set to introduce a bill that would end the Trump administration's practice of separating immigrant children from their parents. The legislation comes less than a month after Attorney General Jeff Sessions made his threat to migrants crossing the U.S.-Mexico border.
If you are smuggling a child, then we will prosecute you. And that child may be separated from you as required by law.
Since then, reports of babies torn from their mother's arms by ICE officers have drawn outrage and widespread calls for an end to the practice. Today, the ACLU, National Domestic Workers Alliance, and other groups have called a nonviolent National Day of Action for Children. They're planning protests in at least 36 cities across the United States. President Trump called today for the firing of comedian Samantha Bee after she called Ivanka Trump the C word on her TBS show Full Frontal. Trump tweeted, quote, why aren't they firing no-talent Samantha Bee for the horrible language used on her low-rating show? On her show Wednesday, Bee blasted the president's daughter, who's also a senior White House advisor, over child-parent separations at the U.S. border, showing an Obama-era photo of young people sleeping in cages and a photo of Ivanka Trump and her son posted to Instagram last weekend. This is the clip from Samantha Bee's program.
After decades of ignoring the issue, Americans are finally paying attention. Well, most of us. Ivanka Trump, who works at the White House, chose to post the second most oblivious tweet we've seen this week. You know, Ivanka, that's a beautiful photo of you and your child, but let me just say, one mother to another, do something about your dad's immigration practices, you He listens to you. Put on something tight and low-cut and tell your father to stop it.
Samantha Bee apologized for her comments Thursday on Twitter, saying, I crossed a line and I deeply regret it. The watchdog group Common Cause is calling for a probe into whether President Trump is abusing his office to enrich his family, raising the alarm about what it calls cronyism, nepotism, abuses of power, and conflicts of interest in Trump's recent negotiations with China. Trump announced he would save Chinese electronics company ZTE from collapse just 2 days after Beijing invested $500 million into a Trump development project in Indonesia. A week before that, Ivanka Trump's fashion business won approval for trademarks in China. Ivanka Trump abruptly left a conference call with reporters on Tuesday when asked about her business in China. In Washington, D.C., the nation's largest union of federal employees has filed suit against an executive order that severely limits the amount of time government workers can spend on union activity. Trump signed the order last Friday, along with other measures that'll make it easier to fire federal workers while compelling federal agencies to negotiate less union-friendly contracts. The president of the American Federation of Government Employees, J. David Cox, said in a statement, "This is a democracy, not a dictatorship. No president should be able to undo a law he doesn't like through administrative fiat." In Las Vegas, Nevada, more than 50,000 casino and restaurant workers are poised to walk out on strike today after their union contracts expired at midnight. Early this morning, the culinary union Local 226 reached a tentative 5-year deal with Caesars Entertainment covering some 12,000 workers that'll avert a strike at 9 casino resorts on the Las Vegas Strip. But talks remain ongoing at a further 25 properties where more than 30,000 workers say they're ready to join picket lines later today. In Washington, D.C., prosecutors have dropped felony charges against several people who face possible decades-long prison terms after they were arrested at President Trump's Inauguration Day, Disrupt J20 protests in early 2017. The dismissals came after defense lawyers told the court that federal prosecutors hid dozens of videos from the protesters in a breach of court procedure known as a Brady violation. Although a jury found a first round of defendants not guilty last December, prosecutors have continued to press felony charges against scores of people that could see some of them imprisoned for as much as 60 years. To see our full coverage of the J20 protest trials, you can go to democracynow.org. In Northern Ireland, pro-choice activists deployed robots on the streets of Belfast Thursday to distribute abortion medication in defiance of a near-total ban on abortions. Police seized the 2 robots and the pills they were distributing and said they were investigating whether to press criminal charges. The protests came just days after voters in the Republic of Ireland voted to resoundingly repeal a constitutional ban on most abortions. The move left Northern Ireland as the only part of the United Kingdom and one of the last parts of Europe where abortions are effectively outlawed. This is pro-choice campaigner Eleanor Malone.
We have a number of volunteers, activists who have volunteered to take safe but illegal abortion pills publicly in defiance of the law. And we are doing this to say that we're not willing to be the bastion of backwardness in the developed world. We have a situation where after the victory of the yes vote in the repeal referendum, Northern Ireland will be one of only 2 jurisdictions in Europe to effectively criminalise women for having abortions, and we're just not willing to accept that.
In Argentina, hundreds of women rallied outside the Congress in Buenos Aires Thursday as lawmakers debated whether to legalize abortion in the predominantly Catholic country. Argentina currently only allows abortion with the permission of a judge in cases of rape or a risk to a pregnant woman's life. In Croatia, border police opened fire Thursday on a van carrying 29 migrants from Afghanistan and Iraq, injuring 9 people. Police say they fired when the van tried to avoid a roadblock set up to interdict migrants entering the country from Bosnia. Among those hurt were 2 young children. In Hawaii, FEMA has ordered the evacuation of parts of a neighborhood on the state's Big Island as fast-moving lava from Kilauea volcano threatened to destroy more homes. The evacuation zone is home to some 2,000 people. At least 77 houses have been destroyed since the volcano erupted last month. Officials also warn the threat of toxic gases, choking ash plumes, and volcanic glass falling from the sky. And a prison watchdog is calling for an end to the practice of prisons charging co-payments to prisoners seeking medical care. 42 states and the federal prison system charge prisoners up to $8 to see a doctor. The Prison Policy Initiative says of the practice, when you're making pennies an hour or nothing at all, a small copay can be the equivalent of hundreds of dollars. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Today we spend the hour looking at the ongoing opioid epidemic and how it's spread across the United States. Drug overdoses are now the leading cause of death for Americans under the age of 50. But during a speech on Tuesday, President Trump claimed the numbers are way down. He spoke in Nashville, Tennessee.
We got $6 billion for opioid and getting rid of that scourge that's taking over our country. And the numbers are way down. We're getting the word out. Bad stuff. You go to the hospital, you have a broken arm, you come out, you're a drug addict with this crap. It's way down. We're doing a good job with it. But we got $6 billion to help us with opioid.
In fact, the latest statistics show there was an increase of opioid-related deaths and overdoses during Trump's first year in office. According to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, drug overdose deaths involving opioids rose to about 46,000 for the 12-month period that ended October 2017, up about 15% from October 2016. The epidemic has been so widespread that life expectancy is falling in the United States for the first time in 50 years. Meanwhile, the White House says it's about to launch a series of public service announcements next week on opioid dangers aimed at young people. The ads were developed with Kellyanne Conway, Trump's point person on opioids. This comes as the New York Times published a confidential Justice Department report this week that found manufacturers of the drug OxyContin had access to information showing it was addictive as early as 1996, the first year after the drug hit the market. Purdue Pharma executives were told OxyContin was being crushed and snorted for its powerful narcotic, but still promoted it as less addictive than other opioid painkillers. This report is especially damning because Purdue executives have testified before Congress that they were unaware of the drug's growing abuse until years after it was on the market. Well, for more, we're joined by Barry Meyer, the reporter who broke the story for the New York Times, which is headlined, "Origins of an Epidemic. Purdue Pharma Knew Its Opioids Were Widely Abused." Barry Meyer was a reporter at the New York Times for nearly 30 years, the first journalist to shed a national spotlight on the abuse of OxyContin. His book, Painkiller, An Empire of Deceit and the Origin of America's Opioid Epidemic, was published this week in an updated and expanded edition. He's won the Pulitzer Prize and 2 George Polk Awards for his past reporting on the intersection of business, medicine, and public health. Barry Meyer, welcome to Democracy Now! It's great to have you with us. We'll talk about this latest Justice document that you just got a hold of.
Right. So the basic outlines are this. As you noted, Purdue Pharma has claimed that it first became aware of OxyContin's growing abuse in early 2000. That was about 4 years after its introduction. In fact, what this document showed is that the company had extensive information about OxyContin's abuse in 1997, 1998, 1999. 20
years ago.
Yes, and concealed that information. Didn't tell the FDA, didn't tell doctors, didn't tell patients. And this was a very damning report. I mean, the crimes were so significant that the prosecutors who spent 4 years investigating the company recommended that 3 top executives of Purdue Pharma be indicted for a series of felony crimes like conspiracy to defraud the United States, false statements, and things of that nature. Unfortunately, their efforts were blocked by top administration officials within the Justice Department.
So explain what actually took place.
What took place is the following. Purdue Pharma was given permission to market OxyContin as less prone to abuse and addiction than competing narcotics. I mean, this sort of was like
drugs like
gift.
Vicodin and others.
Exactly. It was a gift from the FDA. They took that gift and they ran with it. They told doctors not only that it might be less prone to abuse and addiction, but that it would be less prone to abuse and addiction. In 2007, they admitted basically lying to doctors, lying to patients by misrepresenting what they had been allowed to say. What we didn't know was that during the course of the investigation that led to that confession, the federal government had also uncovered information to show that not only had they mismarketed the drug, they were aware, almost from the beginning, that people were abusing OxyContin, significantly abusing OxyContin, and they concealed that information. Had they sent a warning about that to the public, OxyContin would have never become a billion-dollar drug, and thousands of lives wouldn't have been affected by it.
We're going to talk about the origins of OxyContin, the Sackler family. We're going to talk about how this drug company grew. But right now, your book came out like over 15 years ago, Painkiller.
Right.
That's before the company was indicted and the corporate officials were indicted. Talk about Rudolph Giuliani, now once again in the headlines because he is Trump's attorney. His role in the rise of OxyContin and preventing a serious prosecution of this company? Well,
Rudolph Giuliani was hired in 2002. A lot of the reporting I did for the Times in 2001 was aimed at the over-aggressive marketing of OxyContin by Purdue Pharma, as well as, the growing reports, public reports about the drug's abuse. They then came under scrutiny by the FDA, by the DEA, and they felt that they needed a public defender, a fixer, if you will. The person they brought in to do that was Rudolph Giuliani. And so he went in with his reputation as a former prosecutor, mayor, and so forth. And
it was right you're talking about right after the 2001, it's September 11th attacks, when he was called America's mayor.
Exactly. And sort of he took that reputation and he sold it to corporations. And one of the corporations he sold it to was Purdue Pharma. And so he became their sort of front man, if you will, their fixer, went to meet with DEA officials, with other officials, and basically spouted the company's line. I mean, I have no idea what Rudy knew about what was in the company's files, whether he was privy to the information that prosecutors later discovered. But he became essentially the person who tried to smooth things over with government officials.
And was particularly powerful because he was a cancer survivor himself and spoke about what it means to reduce pain.
Exactly. And, he made a very, compelling argument. I mean, this drug has valuable uses. It's needed in certain situations. But, what Purdue had done was to basically market this drug as a cure-all for all kinds of pain. And, and with the vast availability of the drug, it poured out onto the streets. And that led to this wave of abuse and addiction.
So who were the officials in Washington, the political appointees in the Justice Department, who intervened? And this also goes to the whole story of West Virginia and a really crusading prosecutor who took this case on.
So basically there were people at the senior levels of the criminal division. Alice Fisher was then the head of the criminal division.
This is under George W. Bush.
Correct. And Alberto Gonzales was the Attorney General at that time. So essentially what happened was in September of 2006, this very small group of prosecutors, as you noted, in far western Virginia, forwarded a report, a confidential report to the Justice Department recommending that serious felony indictments be brought against the executives of Purdue. That report contained extensive exhibits, emails, records that they planned to present to a grand jury to support the call for their indictments. It was backed by the local U.S. attorney there, a man by the name of John Brownlee. And it was backed, in fact, by mid-level officials within Justice Department headquarters. But on October 11th, 2006, 2 weeks before these prosecutors were scheduled to go before a grand jury and seek these indictments, there was an 11th hour meeting at the Justice Department. Purdue brought in its high-powered legal defense team, met with top Justice Department officials like Alice Fisher, and after that meeting, there was a chill on the case. And basically, people like John Brownlee were told, we are not going to give you the resources to support this prosecution. You're on your own if you want to do it. And Brownlee had no resources. He had this small group of people who had spent 4 years, 24 hours a day investigating this company. They were facing a company of unlimited financial and legal firepower. And they really had no choice but to settle the case at that point.
I mean, the story of West Virginia is astounding. As you write in your New York Times piece, starting in 2007, the year of the settlement, distributors of prescription drugs sent enough pain pills to West Virginia over a 5-year period to supply every man, woman, and child with 433 of them. This is according to a report in the Charleston Gazette-Mail. And we're going to talk about West Virginia as ground zero and exactly what happened to these communities with Barry Meyer, author of Painkiller, An Empire of Deceit and the Origin of America's Opioid Epidemic. It's just out this week. Stay with us. Charm by Two-Ton Boa here on Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman. Our guest for the hour is Barry Meyer, the Pulitzer Prize-winning former New York Times journalist, whose book is out again. Well, it's expanded, it's updated, but this is particularly relevant. The book is called Painkiller, An Empire of Deceit and the Origin of America's Opioid Epidemic. It came out in 2003. 15 years, what a difference it makes in this country. How many deaths are we talking about? I mean, you have this incredible description of the death toll, writing, in 2016, 64,000 Americans died from drug overdoses. That number equals the population of cities such as Portland, Maine, Lynchburg, Virginia, and Santa Fe, New Mexico. It was as if in 1 year a plague had entered one of these towns and killed every single inhabitant.
You know, we're in the midst of the greatest public health disaster of the 21st century. It started out with a drug like OxyContin, and it has morphed since then into kind of a hydra-headed beast. On the one hand, you have the misuse and abuse of prescription drugs, and on the other hand, you have this growing death toll from counterfeit versions of drugs like fentanyl. So we're in this very, very complicated situation, and the kind of policies that the government is now proposing may not get us out of it. I mean, we're going to need a real extreme effort to get out of it.
We're talking about, in 20 years, 250,000 people have died.
That's just from prescription painkillers alone. That's from legal drugs. That's from drugs that companies are allowed to produce, sell legally, and that are prescribed by doctors. And that alone is a stunning, startling figure.
So I want to go to an ad from Purdue Pharma. This is from 1998, the ad to market OxyContin. It features Dr. Alan Spanos of North Carolina.
There's no question that our best, strongest pain medicines are the opioids, but these are the same drugs that have a reputation for causing addiction and other terrible things. Now, in fact, the rate of addiction amongst pain patients who are treated by doctors is much less than 1%. They don't wear out, they go on working, they do not have serious medical side effects. And so these drugs, which I repeat are our best, strongest pain medications, should be used much more than they are for patients in pain.
So that is an ad put out by Purdue Pharma, the maker of OxyContin. Barry Meyer.
Well, you know, there was, in the late 1990s, there was a movement to promote, treat pain much more aggressively than it had been in the past. A lot of that movement was funded by Purdue Pharma, people like Dr. Alex Spanos. And there were these tropes, if you will, that, the addiction rate is less than 1%. It was a total lie. There was no basis for that figure, but it was repeated, and it sort of got ingrained into the medical culture. And as a result of that, doctors prescribed more and more of these drugs, in good belief.
The guy he was talking about?
Dr. Spanos, in fact, that video, they made another video, I believe, with Dr. Spanos that involved a patient, and that patient wasn't even on OxyContin. He was on another drug that came out. So, I mean, it was this massive public relations campaign that was funded in large part by Purdue Pharma to sell OxyContin.
Talk about the growth of Purdue Pharma. Talk about the Sackler family. What was unusual about this company? What also makes it so difficult to investigate? Well,
the Sackler family is a fascinating family. As you know, their names are on every museum in the United States, here in New York, at the Metropolitan, and at the National Gallery in Washington.
Their names are on wings. Their names are very prominent.
On elevators, on everything, you name it.
But when it comes to the drug, where they make their fortune, we don't see their name.
Right, and not only that, there were three brothers, Arthur, Raymond, and Mortimer. Arthur was the eldest, and he was sort of this kind of, I guess, evil genius, if you will. He invented the modern-day drug advertising industry. All the ads that we see on TV today or in print are kind of the result of Arthur Sackler's genius, or lack thereof, as you see it. And he kind of wedded together the pharmaceutical industry and the medical profession. He made doctors shills for drug companies. He created medical journals that were really kind of fake medical journals, because drug advertisers had to pay to get their studies into those medical journals. So he created all these deceptive marketing and advertising practices that are commonplace today. He died in 1986, before OxyContin was created. But to get his brothers into the drug industry, he bought this tiny little firm called Purdue Frederick that was located here in New York, in Greenwich Village, as it turned out. They basically sold a lot of kind of crazy stuff. And then eventually, in the mid-1990s, they decided to get into the pain medication business. They first bought a drug called MS-Contin, which was a long-acting form of morphine, and they marketed it mainly to cancer specialists, where the drug was very, very valuable in dealing with cancer pain. But then in the mid-1990s, as this drive to treat pain more aggressively began to unfold, they began to sell OxyContin, which is a long-acting form of the narcotic oxycodone. And this became the most aggressive, high-powered marketing campaign for prescription narcotic in drug industry history. It was financed with Sackler money. The Sacklers were the principal beneficiaries of it. There were something like $31 billion worth of OxyContin sales in subsequent years, and the Sacklers became, I believe, the 14th or 15th richest family in the United States.
I want to go to 1998. Purdue Pharma distributes another video featuring 7 patients who used OxyContin to deal with chronic pain. One of the patients was named Johnny Sullivan.
I got my life back now. Now I can enjoy every day that I live. I can really enjoy myself. And before, even a good day was hell. I mean, I couldn't enjoy nothing. But now I can enjoy myself. That's when I said wonderful. I look at the future the same way a young guy, 25, 30-year-old would.
After appearing in that promotional video for Purdue Pharma, Johnny Sullivan became a severe addict to OxyContin and other opioids. In 2008, he died in a car crash when he fell asleep at the wheel. His wife said because of his addiction, he would often nod off. Barry.
You know, this drug, for some patients, has been a godsend, but for many, many others, it has turned into a nightmare. We focus a lot on the subject of addiction, and rightly so. But not long ago, I interviewed a pain specialist who had been sort of on the bandwagon promoting these drugs when they first came out. And he said to me, you know, addiction is not the real problem with these drugs. It's not the only problem with these drugs. These drugs caused patients to emotionally opt out of life, to become couch potatoes, become withdrawn, to reject their family members and lose social contact. They have all other kinds of troubling side effects. And so, there is now a generation of patients who effectively are emotionally dependent upon these drugs.
A spokesperson for Purdue Pharma said in a statement in response to your article in the New York Times, his company is involved in efforts to address opioid abuse and, quote, suggesting that activities that last occurred more than 16 years ago are responsible for today's complex and multifaceted opioid crisis is deeply flawed. Your response?
I'm not a $600 an hour lawyer. I don't come up with, statements like that, but let me put it in simple terms. Purdue Pharma violated the trust of doctors and patients. It lied to them. The Justice Department discovered reams of information which in their minds showed that this company also concealed extraordinarily powerful information pointing to the abuse of these drugs early on when it was first marketed.
What was the lie to the doctors?
The lie was that OxyContin would be less prone to abuse and addiction than competing painkillers. They admitted that they had told that lie in 2007 and paid $600 million in fines. I mean, that was a drop in the bucket where OxyContin sales were concerned, but they admitted that they had lied.
You write about how Purdue sales reps used a chart to convince doctors that OxyContin was more stable than a traditional narcotic, even though the FDA had told Purdue that the information they were giving out was bogus.
That was just one of many lies that they used. I mean, the entire predicate of the company's marketing campaign was based on a lie. I mean, that's the simplest way of putting it. The Food and Drug Administration had given them permission to say, this drug might be less prone to abuse and addiction. They trained their sales reps to say it was less prone to abuse and addiction. Sales reps would go, and sales reps didn't know what the reality was, but they would go to doctors and pharmacists and say, you can't inject OxyContin. You can't extract the oxycodone from OxyContin and inject it because, the junkie will get a heart attack. They'll drop over and die. This is a safe drug. This is much safer. It was all an incredible lie. And at the same time, the company was concealing what was probably the most significant information they needed to tell doctors, which was this drug was being widely abused.
Who is Laura Nagel?
Laura Nagel was the head, a key figure within the DEA at the time of this episode. She was in charge of the division of DEA that went after the diversion of legal drugs onto the street. It wasn't sort of the narcs, the guys who busted people for selling heroin or cocaine, but it was the diversion division which dealt with the misuse of prescription drugs.
And what did she do?
She was a hero. She was a fighter. She saw what was going on. She realized that this company, A, was overly aggressively, promoting this drug, to the nines, that people were dying from this drug. She tried to call them to account, and they essentially unleashed as much legal and lobbying firepower on her to basically try to roll her over.
And what happened?
She basically backed off, just like everyone else in those days who came up against Purdue Pharma.
So let's talk about Ground Zero, West Virginia. What was happening in some of these towns, in some of these small, independent drugstores that were bringing in how much of this drug?
They were bringing in huge amounts of this drug. I mean, tens and tens of millions of pills annually of this drug.
How did it start in West Virginia?
I mean, OxyContin was being distributed to West Virginia, to Virginia and other states. Drugstores were prescribing it. But, you had doctors there that were essentially running what are called pill mills. People would come into the doctor and say, "Doctor, I heard I have pain." "Oh, fine, let me just write you a prescription." "Oh, and OxyContin works really well for me, for my pain." So you had these doctors who were writing prescriptions for drugs at the request of the patient, which is a rare situation. And so then these patients, who are often drug abusers, would go to the pharmacy and get the prescriptions filled. Sometimes I in my travels on this story, I would go to small towns where the doctor had a pharmacy in his office. So he'd write the prescription, you'd go next door to a pharmacy that he owned, and they would dispense the drug. So, millions of these pills were being dispensed. They were ending up on the street, and these horror shows of crime and abuse and separated families and everything else would follow.
I'm looking at a piece that you refer to in your piece. This is in the West Virginia Gazette-Mail. And it says, in southern West Virginia, many of the pharmacies that received the largest shipments of prescription opioids were small, independent drugstores like ones in Raleigh and Wyoming counties that ordered 600,000 to 1.1 million oxycodone pills a year. Or they were locally owned pharmacies in Mingo and Logan where wholesalers distributed 1.4 million to 4.7 million hydrocodone pills annually. By contrast, the Walmart at Charleston Southridge Center, one of the retail giant's busiest stores in West Virginia, shipped out about 5,000 oxycodone and 9,500 hydrocodone pills each year.
Yeah, I mean, it's startling. I think one of the things that happened when the Justice Department did not crack down really on Purdue Pharma is it sent a signal that drug companies, drug distributors, you can ship these drugs in whatever quantity you want to wherever you want, and the worst that you're going to face is a fine. So they viewed it as a cost of doing business. There was never going to be any accountability for the corporate executives. It wasn't going to be like the dealer or the drug addict who was going to end up in prison. All the corporate executives were going to have to pay was a small fine, and that was going to be a fraction of the profits that they were going to make by shipping huge quantities of the drugs to places like West Virginia.
We're going to continue this conversation with Barry Meyer, author of Painkiller, An Empire of Deceit and the Origin of America's Opioid Epidemic. After this break, I want to ask you about Art Van Lee, a doctor in Virginia. Stay with us.
If ever this motorcycle goes slip in the mud now, well, let me have these children to carry down the blood. If ever these ruby rings are slipping from my cold fingers, well, let them be passed down now, and honey, let my ghost linger. Well, I will raise them, I will raise them, I will raise, I will raise, I will raise them. Oh, in the city, surrounded by water. Now give me dollars and make them 1, 2, 3. I will raise them. They'll go to church with me every day.
Give Me Daughters by Jonathan Fireeater, member of Stuart Lupton, passed away this week at 43. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman. Our guest is Barry Meyer, author of Painkiller, An Empire of Deceit and the Origin of America's Opioid Epidemic. Tell us the story of Dr. Art Van Zee.
You know, Art Van Zee is kind of the hero of my book. He's a man I met when I was reporting for the Times back in the early 2000s. He's a small-town doctor. He lives in a town called Pennington Gap in very western Virginia near the Kentucky border. And I met him. He's a gracious, lovely person. He reminded me of kind of a Doctors Without Borders, but here in the U.S., you know, working in Appalachia, in an area that desperately needed medical care. He realized that his town was being overrun by OxyContin abuse. He saw kids being addicted to it, went to the hospital on emergency visits, and he decided eventually that he had to do something. He couldn't stand quiet and let this unfold. And he tried to lead a small town campaign to get the FDA to pull this drug off the market, or at least to crack down on this drug. And Painkiller kind of follows his saga and the saga of other people in the town. A wonderful nun there by the name of Sister Beth, who sort of tried to take on this huge, powerful drug company and hold it to account.
And so what happened to Dr. Art Van Zee?
You know, Art Van Zee, like Laura Nagle, eventually got shouted down, got ignored. I mean, there's this rather pivotal Senate hearing where he comes and he pleads with the senators to do something about this drug. And Chris Dodd, the Democratic senator from Connecticut at the time, starts raking him over the coals and sounds like he's badgering him with talking points that had been given to him by Purdue Pharma. And lo and behold, when I started looking at campaign finance records and other documents, it turned out that Chris Dodd had met with Purdue Pharma prior to this hearing, and Chris Dodd had gotten a $10,000 contribution from Purdue Pharma shortly afterwards. So Purdue Pharma, was spreading money around and going after its critics and co-opting them throughout this entire period. I mean, the U.S. attorney in Maine who first sounded a public alarm.
First one in the country.
In the country in 2001. He went immediately onto the payroll of Purdue Pharma and became one of its biggest defenders. In fact, I found documents that suggested that he was discussing a job with them even before he left public office. He swore up and down that wasn't the case, but in fact their emails, Purdue Pharma's own emails, suggesting that he had reached out to them to discuss job opportunities.
Explain the nature of the settlement in 2007. Can can individuals in the company be held criminally responsible today? 200,000 deaths later in the last 20 years, though they would argue that's not all us.
Right. So the settlement was twofold. The company, Purdue Pharma, as a company, pled guilty to a felony charge called misbranding, which was essentially misrepresenting the drug, and paid $600 million in fines. The three top executives of the company, pled guilty to a misdemeanor version of that charge. It was a sort of weird charge because it only held them liable in their roles as corporate executives. It did not accuse them personally of any wrongdoing. They paid around about $34 million in fines. But what we came to discover, and what was in the Times in the other day and in the expanded version of the book, is that the prosecutors on the case wanted to charge them also with very serious felonies that could have put them in jail had that case gone forward.
And talking about holding people responsible, you write about how those that do drugs together, a husband could be found guilty of murdering his wife, etc. Talk about that.
Well, we have a different standard of justice in this country. One standard is for the person who gets caught with, some drugs in their pocket. Another standard is for the person who's caught selling drugs. And another standard is for the executives of corporations that allow these drugs to get into the wrong hands of people, or knowingly are aware that these drugs are being abused and don't say anything. And, you know, there seems to be very little punishment that those kinds of individuals face.
But what do people face on the ground who are doing drugs?
They face spending the rest of their life in prison.
Explain.
You know, they can be sent away for 10 years, for 20 years. They can have their lives destroyed, whereas the corporate executives don't see their bonuses going down. They don't see their lives being ruined. They just go on with their lives.
Earlier this year, New York Mayor Bill de Blasio announced that New York would sue manufacturers and distributors of prescription opioids to account for their part in the city's ongoing deadly opioid epidemic. Firms named in the suit include Purdue Pharma, Johnson & Johnson, and McKesson Corporation.
This is a man-made crisis if ever there was one, fueled by corporate greed, fueled by the actions of big pharmaceutical companies that hooked millions of Americans on opioids to begin with. And some of them still are addicted to prescription drugs, and others have migrated to heroin. But we know where it began for so many people. And bluntly, it was so a very few people could profit. And obviously, the horrible actions of criminals who sell drugs and profit in death as well, that combination has led to where we are today. We need to remember that those origins, that the root of this problem means it's a problem that can be defeated. We can fight back against the big pharmaceutical companies. We can fight back against the criminals who peddle drugs. We can change in so many ways, including changing the entire culture around this issue so we can help people.
So that's New York Mayor Bill de Blasio. More than 60 U.S. cities and over a dozen states are now suing Big Pharma over opioids. What does this mean?
Well, this could have happened a long time ago, Amy. You know, what's startling to me is, as someone who's watched this over almost 2 decades, is the issue of why did we wait this long to do this? We could have done this in 2003, in 2007, in 2010, in 2012. We have allowed this to morph into this horrible situation. It's a good thing that it's happening now, and I really do hope that these cities and states carry through and get to the truth and not walk away with a simple settlement the way the Justice Department did in 2007. The only way that this problem is really going to be solved is if we really understand what happened, if the truth about what happened comes out. I mean, the fact that, you know, this confidential memo has now come out adds to the truth of what we know.
And again, say what is the essential point in this confidential memo?
The essential point is that Purdue Pharma has claimed from day one, and still claims today, that it first became aware of OxyContin's growing abuse in 2000. This memo shows that prosecutors believe that they were aware of the drug's abuse for years before that and concealed that information.
And what about the lawsuits of New York and 60 other cities and towns? What are they trying to accomplish with these lawsuits?
They're trying to get money. They're trying to get money to pay for some of the medical costs that they've had to absorb as a result of prescription drug and overdoses and addictions. It's very similar to the tobacco lawsuits, which I also covered for the Times. It's essentially taxpayers have borne the brunt of the health care costs related to prescription painkillers. Purdue Pharma hasn't paid for it. Johnson & Johnson hasn't paid for it. These drug distributors haven't paid for it. They've only profited from it. So now these states and towns are trying to recover some of the costs from the people who profited from this trade.
Barry Meyer, what about the American Medical Association?
It's funny you should bring that up. The American Medical Association has been over time, one of the big stumbling blocks to the solution of this problem. Back in 2001, I met a wonderful doctor, Dr. Nathaniel Katz, and he argued that doctors should be required to undergo some type of mandatory training as a condition for prescribing prescription drugs like OxyContin. Like 6 hours of training, 8 hours of training. You could do it on your home. You could do it through some sort of, thing on the internet. Very simple. The AMA fought this tooth and nail. As recently as the Obama administration, the White House Office of Drug Policy wanted to propose a law to make this happen. AMA lobbyists came to officials of the White House and to the Obama administration and said, if you do this, we will fight you tooth and nail. We will not allow this to happen. This is too much of a burden for our members. They don't have 6 hours or 8 hours to spend looking at information on how to prescribe these drugs more safely. So I think they have a lot on their shoulders here. They basically blocked taking a very simple step that would have been would have provided tremendous good for patients and for doctors.
So the Sacklers didn't put their name on the drug company and are very secretive family when it comes to that, but very public when it comes to supporting the big museums, like you said, the Met in New York and the Sackler Wing. Do you think, given that these big art institutions and universities around the country get federal funding, that they should have their names stripped from these wings?
Well, that's really up to the institutions and these medical schools to decide.
Explain the medical school connection.
Well, they fund a lot of medical schools. They fund a lot of educational programs at medical schools. There's been a lot. There was a wonderful piece that Christopher Glazik did in the Esquire and Patrick Keith did in the New Yorker about the Sacklers. And, I wrote about them extensively in Painkiller. They've now become the face of this problem. And so, museums and
maybe name the wings after the victims of their drugs.
Well, either that or have information about their donors.
So next week begins the big push. The White House, in conjunction with the Ad Council, will be debuting public service messages that should shock the conscience, they say. What do you think needs to be done?
Well, I think that we have a two-headed beast that we're dealing with. One thing that is being done, and unfortunately it's come about a decade too late, but it's being done now, is a reassessment of the use of drugs like OxyContin in the treatment of medical conditions. As I said, it's a valuable drug, but there are many other ways to treat pain and treat common types of pain that are just as effective as the use of pain pills. And employers and unions need to make sure that their members and employees are getting the best possible pain treatment, not pills which are profitable for drug companies and cheap for insurers. So that's one side of the problem.
We have 15 seconds.
The other side problem is the illegal side, and that's really a law enforcement issue. Cracking down on countries like China and Mexico that ship the chemicals that are used to make these horrible and dangerous illegal street drugs.
Well, I want to thank you for being with us. Barry Meyer, author of Painkiller, An Empire of Deceit and the Origin of America's Opioid Epidemic, just out this week, updated and expanded. Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, formerly with the New York Times. That does it for our show. I'll be speaking in Atlanta, Georgia on Saturday, the 50th anniversary of the Great Speckled Bird. 5 p.m. at the Chosewood Ballroom. Check our website at democracynow.org. Oh, and Democracy Now! Is accepting applications for our paid video production fellowships. Find out more at democracynow.org. Democracy Now! Produced by Mike Burke, Renee Feldstein, and Guzman Marine Sheikh. I'm Amy Goodman. Thanks for joining us.